Hi, I'm Matt and welcome to Tech Tested. Today we're going to be doing a tutorial on how to build a PC. So if you haven't built a PC before, you can follow along and learn how to build one yourself. Okay, we're assuming you've already bought all of your components and you already know that they all work together. So we're gonna start from that spot. Something you wanna do before you even start building your PC is make sure you've got a couple things. First thing is you're definitely gonna wanna make sure you have a nice screwdriver. I like this screwdriver that came with a CPU cooler I bought because it's got a particularly long neck, which makes getting into hard to reach places very easy. Another thing you're gonna want to get is a pair of side cutters. Now you can tell this is a quite old pair that I have had for many years, but it works just fine. The third thing I think everyone should get before they build a PC is a bag of zip ties or tie straps, depending on what you want to call them. That helps with your cable management immensely, and that's actually why you need your side cutters. Now, when building a PC, you want to make sure you are working in a very non-static environment and preferably using an anti-static pad such as we have here. Something else you might want to consider if you are working in a more static area is using an anti-static wristband that you tie to a ground and around your wrist. There is a third option though, which I will be showing you, and that is plugging in your power supply while you're doing the build and periodically touching your power supply to make sure you're grounded. All right, so first thing we're gonna do is get our power supply and remove it from its box. Here is our power supply. This is a non-modular variant, which means all of the cables are already attached to the power supply. But if you get a modular variant, there will be little slots where you can plug in the exact number of cables that you need instead of having extra ones that you may not need. Take your power cord, plug it into the back of the power supply, and then take the other end, plug it into an outlet. Now we set that off to the side. Again, periodically touching it so that you're grounded while you're building your PC. Next, we're going to assemble some of the components outside of the case, and then we will proceed to put them inside the case before we turn on our PC. First step is to grab the box that your motherboard came in, or equivalent box that you can start assembling your system outside of the case on. Here we have a motherboard box that didn't come with this motherboard, but will work just fine. Next, grab your motherboard and set it on the box. And it helps quite a bit if you set it off to the side so that when you install any expansion cards, they will slide in the slot of the box. First thing you're gonna notice about this system is it is actually very old. This is from the early 2000s, and I couldn't afford to purchase brand new components, so I thought it would be a lot more interesting if we did something a little bit dated. However, all of the principles in regards to building a PC are going to apply here as well. Any differences we will note, and we will show you something more modern so that you can follow along in that regard. This is an old Pentium Intel processor, and it uses a very similar socket type to modern AMD processors. Not in that the socket is the same, but the fact that it is a pin grid array instead of a land grid array setup. So as you can see, there's already a processor installed, but we will be upgrading the processor, so we will be removing it. To remove a processor, just lift up on the retention arm and grab it on either side. If you can avoid touching the top, always avoid touching the top and remove it. Now, when installing a processor, you want to make sure that you line up the arrows on your CPU and your motherboard. If you look at the motherboard, you can see right here in this corner, there is a small arrow. And if you look on our processor, you can see right here that there is a small arrow. So you line those up when installing the processor. Set it in gently, and then grab it on the sides and try to wiggle it around a little bit to make sure that it is properly installed in the CPU socket. Then just lower your retention arm and clip it into place. Next, what you want to do is install your RAM. This is old DDR memory, but the installation principle is identical. You want to make sure that you line up the notch with the notch in the motherboard, like you see there. Every system that uses RAM is going to use a slot like that. They will be in different positions depending on the generation you use, but the principle still applies. You set it in on either end of the slot, and then on either end, you slowly press down. This may seem like you're gonna break something, but you aren't. Press down until you hear a nice click. It should click in on both ends, and as you can see, the tabs on both ends of the RAM are fully seated inside the slots on the ends of the RAM stick. Do the same thing with your next RAM DIMM. Set it in, and then press down firmly till you hear the clicks. This motherboard has 2 slots and supports dual channel memory. However, most modern motherboards have 4 RAM slots, which is still dual channel memory, but you can use up to 4 DIMMs. If you only have 2 DIMMs, you want to alternate which slot you put them in, starting from the left. So you'll put one in, skip a slot, install in the next slot, and then skip the last slot. Now we are going to be applying the thermal paste. There are multiple methods that are perfectly acceptable, but the most commonly used one is putting a pea-sized amount of thermal paste in the center of the CPU. The reason for that is the die for the CPU is actually underneath this big piece of metal, and it usually is just in the center of the processor, right about that size. So you want to make sure your thermal paste is applied in the center, and when you install your CPU cooler, it will squeeze it out to the edges. You can also take something like a guitar pick or a credit card and spread it out over the entire integrated heat spreader if you like, but that is not necessary, so we will not be doing that today. Now that we have applied our thermal paste, we will be installing our CPU cooler. Note that when you install your CPU cooler, you want to make sure that the fan cable is oriented near the CPU fan header. On most motherboards, that is either at the top or somewhere right around the CPU socket. As you can see on this motherboard, it is right next to the CPU socket, right at the top of the motherboard. You want to slowly set your CPU cooler down on your CPU, and then on this particular socket, you need to install these metal clips, starting with the far end first on both sides, and then on the sides with the levers, you press down firmly until they clip into the plastic hooks. Next thing you want to do is install your CPU fan header. And now your CPU cooler is installed. You can see we swapped out our motherboards, and the reason is the CPU cooler mounting system on that old system is not in any way indicative of any modern systems today. So we brought along a more modern system. This is an AM3 platform, and we will be showing you how to install a CPU cooler on this system, which is the same installation setup as any modern AMD processor. You do the same thing with your thermal paste. Apply a small amount in the center. And then, like before, you make sure your fan cable header is near the CPU fan header on your motherboard, which again is in a similar spot up at the top. And then slowly lower the CPU cooler down onto the CPU. And then you want to make sure these retention clips are installed on the end without an arm first onto this little clip here on the motherboard. Then you do the same on the opposite side. And then you slowly flip over the retention arm all the way till it is rotated, and it will seem firm, but it is not too tight. It is designed to feel that tight. And then you install your CPU fan into your CPU fan header. That's how you install a modern AMD CPU cooler. As you can see, our old motherboard is back. So what we are going to be doing next is showing you how to install the video card. Now, this is our AGP video card. This is a very old standard, and it has been superseded by PCI Express, but the principle is still the same. Line it up with the slot that corresponds with your graphics card. And then you slowly press down until it is in the graphics card slot and you hear the clip. Next, we'll be showing you how to install the power supply connectors. Many modern graphics cards actually have power connectors connected to them, and they are usually either a 6-pin or a 6+2 pin that will usually go on the end of the graphics card. This graphics card doesn't have it. Some modern graphics cards don't have it, but many do, so keep that in mind. Next, we will be taking our 24-pin connector and plugging it into the motherboard. Something you may not know, and is actually relevant on this older system, is this is actually a 20+4 pin. The 20-pin connector is designed for older systems like this one, and the 4-pin you add on simply by sliding it on like this for more modern systems, and that would plug into your motherboard. But since this is an older system, we will be just using our 20-pin. You bring it over here, you make sure that the clip side aligns with the protrusion on the connector on the motherboard so that it clips when you install it. Take it, line it up, then press firmly down till you hear the click. We will be doing the same thing with our CPU connector. Now this, similarly, is actually called a 4+4 connector. Many people call it an 8-connector CPU connector, but some modern systems and a lot of older systems only use 4 of the pins. So today we are going to be installing 4 of the 4+4 pin connector into our motherboard. It is located usually very near the CPU, and in this particular instance, it is located right next to the CPU and this bank of capacitors. Again, make sure that the clip on the connector is lined up with the protrusion on the motherboard header, and then you just slowly, that might be the wrong end. Yep. All right. As you can see, there are 2 different, these actually aren't identical. So take the correct side and plug it into the motherboard until you hear the click. Now we have our CPU connector hooked up, our motherboard connector hooked up, and last we are going to hook up our hard drive. Now modern systems use what is called SATA, or some even use M.2. We don't have an M.2 example, but many computers still use SATA. This computer actually has an older standard we will be using, and it also has SATA as well. So we'll be showing you how to install both. You will take this SATA cable, and as you can see, it's got a notch in the end of the connector. You line that up with the SATA connector on your motherboard here. As you can see, there is a notch on this end. So we lined up the notch with the notch on the motherboard. You slide it in until you hear the click. Now we take our SSD. This is a 120GB SSD, and it has the same connector as the motherboard does. As you can see, there is the protrusion there, and there is the receiver there. So you line that up and connect it. Now to power the SSD, you take if I can ever get to it, you take a SATA cable, which looks a lot like the SATA cable that you plugged into the other end of the SSD, but it's much wider. So you take this end from your power supply, you identify the same spot on your SSD, which you can see it has the protrusion there. We take the receiving end like this and plug it in like so. All right, in a modern system, now you would be ready to boot up your computer after you hook up the monitor. And that is good practice to do outside of the case. That way, if you run into any issues, you don't have to tear down your entire computer to identify the problem. We have already done that off camera, so we aren't going to be hooking up the monitor. We are now going to proceed to building the computer inside the case. All right, since we're going to be installing all these components into the case now, we will be removing any hard drives, power supply connectors, and graphics cards, or any other add-in cards you have in order to install it into the case. However, we will still be leaving the CPU, CPU cooler, and RAM installed so that we can put them into the case as one unit. And we will be grabbing our computer case. I decided it would be fitting to put a really old system into a much more modern case. I thought that would be a lot of fun, give an old system a little bit more flair. So first thing you want to do is actually pull off both side panels. A lot of people say pull off the front one, but only pull off the back one if you need to. It's a lot easier to remove that back panel before you start your build than it is to do halfway through your build. So we're going to go ahead and remove both the back and the front side panels. You unscrew the thumb screw like I just did, and then there's usually a little handle here that you pull on. Oh, there's a bottom thumb screw as well on this one. Remove that thumb screw as well. And then you just pull, and then you can pull it away from the case and set it off to the side. Do the same thing with the front panel. And I don't have the thumb screw for that particular, the bottom thumb screw for that particular side panel, but you do the same thing. Pull it back a little bit and then pull it forward and set that one off to the side as well. You need to be aware of what instances apply to your particular case and follow along in your user manual so that you don't mess something up just because we have a slightly different case than you. So next step is unplug your power supply from the wall. And we are going to take it, and in this particular case, the power supply goes in a tray beneath the system, and you want to make sure that the fan is facing down. This particular case has a fan filter in the bottom for air to come in through the bottom, so that's how you get your ventilation. If you install it upside down, you will choke all the air going to your power supply. So make sure you follow your case's instructions. In this particular case, we will be installing it with the fan side down. We slide it down into what's called the basement. And then we come over here and line up the screw holes. There are 4 screw holes, here, 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 and here. That's pretty standard on most cases. Now take the hardware included with your case, find the screws appropriate for holding your power supply. They often have a coarser thread than a bunch of the other screws included if they aren't marked. But if they are marked, make sure you use the screws that are designated for the power supply hold. Now this next part is a step that is specific to this case, but it does have this in common with many other modern cases, but again, check for your case specifications. It has a hard drive bay installed in the basement, so we are going to remove that. There is a single screw that holds that in, and then it has 4 standoff screws that you just pull up, and you can pull it out. And then this is where you install your hard drive. Now, something you want to make sure you get right the first time in order to avoid removing your hard drive and installing it again is make sure you install it in the proper orientation. In this particular case, you want to make sure the connectors are facing towards the back of the case or the back side panel. And to do that, make sure you pay attention to how you pull the hard drive cage out. In this case, we pulled it out like this, so we will be sliding the hard drive into the cage like this. All right. And make sure you install the appropriate screws into your hard drive in order to make sure it stays securely in the hard drive cage. All right, now that we have our hard drive properly installed into our hard drive cage, I'm going to slide it into its spot in the case. Now we won't be using an SSD in this particular build, but we are going to cover a little bit of how to install it just in case you do. Most cases nowadays have mounts on the back of the motherboard tray inside the case in order to mount your SSD, and this case is no exception. There are mounts here for your SSD. It will also have either screws that you screw in from the other side into your SSD, or like this case, it will have standoffs that you can just gently set the SSD in and then slide it down. Now make sure when you do this that your connectors are facing down towards the bottom of the case and not up towards the top of the case so that you can get your connectors installed nice and easily. All right. Now we are ready to install the motherboard. So take your case, flip it up, We're gonna have to reconnect that. Turn it around, and it's good practice to make sure that you aren't pinching any of your cables between the sides of the case when you set it down. So make sure that they're all not getting crushed. Then here we are. Now, many people will say that you want to install your motherboard before your power supply. That is perfectly fine. I understand why they do it. I do that sometimes. However, in this particular case, I like to have the cables, especially the cables for the CPU, run because they might be difficult to install once the motherboard is already in there. Now, something I want to point out really quick before we go any farther is the standoffs. Most cases come with the standoffs pre-installed. However, if your case does not, please make sure you install them. If you screw your motherboard into the computer case without the standoffs, it is very likely you will short something out. Most modern computer motherboards will actually have a short protection, but that is not something you want to rely on. You still could damage your components. So let me point to where these standoffs are. In this particular case, they are here, 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 and here. Now, as you can see, there are positions for other ones with different motherboard orientations. You can also have standoffs here, here, and I believe that these are also spots where you could have different standoffs. However, the ones that are already installed are perfectly fine for our case. Grab your motherboard. Now, the best way to do this is to grab it by the CPU cooler, assuming it's properly mounted, because that is going to be a very strong place to grab it by, and it makes for a very nice handle. So, actually, I almost messed up. Before you install your motherboard, make sure you install your IO shield. Now, the way you do that is you take it and slide it in the back of the case. Make sure these circles are towards the bottom of your case, because that is the connector ports for your audio connectors, which are almost always at the bottom of your motherboard. Also, make sure the flat side is towards the inside of the case and the raised side is going towards the back of your case. So you simply set it into this big slot here, and you will press it in on all the sides until you hear the snap. However, there's one problem. This is not the right IO shield for this motherboard, so we are going to be removing it, and we are not using an IO shield. If you do have your IO shield, use it. It does help protect from any debris getting inside your case. However, it is not the end of the world if you don't have it. So next step, grab your motherboard, preferably by the CPU cooler. It makes for a fantastic handle and should be more than adequate to handle the weight of the motherboard. Slowly lower it in, and then once you get it low enough, you can slide it towards the back of the case where the IO shield would go. And the easiest way to line it up is to find a standoff that lines up in the center here. That's usually the easiest one to find. And then once you've found all the other ones, actually, I need to make sure that all these standoffs, actually, we have just run into a small issue. So this is something that is good to know. If you set your motherboard in and you don't see all of the standoffs lining up, I can see this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, but there is not one for this particular spot. If you notice that, make sure to pull your motherboard back out, and if there should be a standoff there, make sure to put one there. You may have to move one. In this particular instance, you can see this standoff is actually not in the right spot. It needs to be down here. We have now moved our standoff from this position to this position for our motherboard, and I actually rerouted the 24 pin to the upper side because I noticed that that's where we need it on our motherboard. So we will be installing our motherboard now. So set it down in and then slide it back and line it up with your standoffs. And then take the appropriate screws and screw them in. You'll need to screw in a standoff here, 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 up here by the CPU connector, here, and here. So we'll go ahead and do that. All right, we just finished installing our motherboard screws, and next we're gonna start plugging things in. Next thing to install is our front panel IO connectors. Your motherboard should say on it where each of these are, but if they don't, your owner's manual should also indicate where they go. This will vary from motherboard to motherboard potentially. Your power LED and your HD LED are dependent upon voltage and ground, but your power switch and your reset switch are not, so make sure you plug those in properly. Next, we will be plugging in our front panel audio. That is this connector. And as you can, so make sure you find the connector that has the same pin out. And I am trying to locate it. It would appear that on this motherboard, it is all the way over here. All right, and last but not least, our USB. Now I have this adapter for regular USB to USB 3.0 because this motherboard does not support USB 3.0. This is your regular USB connector. Plug it in on the USB front panel header. Like so. Now we are going to plug in our ribbon connector. Now remember, the single side goes for the motherboard. We've got the notch and the notch. So we just press firmly and it will go in there. We have our 20+4 pin connector. Remember, clip goes with the indent. Plug it in like that. And we have our 4+4 pin connector, which plugs in the same way it did earlier. If we can get it to plug in properly. All right, that's plugged in. And then last but not least, what we'll be plugging into our motherboard is our AGP card. Now what you need to do before you do that is remove these back panel covers that correspond to your particular slot. We just need to remove the top one. Now this is going to differ from case to case. On this one, it's actually quite simple. You loosen this thumb screw, so this slides up, and you loosen the corresponding screw to your cover. Take the screw out, lift this up, and you can remove your back cover. Now take your AGP card, or graphics card in a more modern situation, and you line it up, and assuming all goes well, you slide it in and listen for the click. Take that same screw that you unscrewed for the cover and screw it in to hold down your graphics card. And last but not least on this part, you slide down this cover, tighten down the thumb screw, and you're good to go there. Now we get to the fun part, cable management. So we are going to feed our ribbon connector in through here. So it can get down to the hard drive. We are going to lay our computer case down like so. Right now I'm going to be plugging the fans into the motherboard. All right, so let's see here. This particular motherboard, I think, only has one fan header, and it is down here by the IO. You can tell by the 3 pins with the tab on it. Some of them might have 4 pins with the tab. That is fine. You can plug a 3-pin or a 4-pin into either a 3-pin or a 4-pin connector. That's not a problem. You just won't have some of the functionalities if you don't match the right sizes, but if they're not there, that's fine. So we are going to, and if you were thinking ahead like me, you would actually do it a little bit differently. You would run it behind the motherboard tray through this hole, which I will actually probably just do really quick. But that's how you plug it in. All right, now we are going to start cable managing the back. So we are going to lay the computer down like this. We already have our Molex plugged in for our hard drive, or we'll be plugging in our connector for the data here. All right, now all of these cables look to be a mess. This is the fan header for the back fan in our case. However, I thought there was a motherboard connector for it, but there's not. There is a solution though. Some fans come with these little connectors that convert it from a 4-pin to a Molex. If they don't come with it, you can purchase these separately, but we will be using another one of those Molex connectors to hook up our fan. So this just slots in like a regular fan connector, and then you can hook it up to your Molex, which we have one right here. So this is where we get to cable management, and this is where your zip ties come in. There are little tabs on the back of your case here that you can see where you can slip a zip tie in to hold down your cables. So what we'll do is we'll try to collect up as many of our cables as possible in a single space. However, if you do this, keep in mind you don't want your cables to be stacked so high that you aren't able to get your back panel on. So that's something you definitely need to keep in mind. And this is not the cleanest cable management job. This is a little bit quick and dirty, but that's how we like it here on this channel. Some cases include zip ties, but a lot of them don't. So that's why I always keep some spares on hand. Also, you can route these other cables towards this side of the case because we do have some of the same tabs to hook them up with. All right. This isn't the cleanest cable management job. You can spend a lot of time making sure your cable management is much more pretty than this, but this is good enough to get our back panel on, which is the next step. So take your back panel, put it into position. Sometimes if your cable management is bad or if you have a lot of cables, this will be very difficult. Fortunately, this case is more than adequate to make up for my bad cable management. Slide the back panel forward like I just did, grab your thumb screw, and put it back where it came from when you first disassembled the case. And do the same thing with your front panel. Here's our front glass panel. Set it, slide it, and install your thumb screws. I am missing one of the thumb screws for the back panel, but I'm going to be installing 2 thumb screws on the front panel in order to help prevent it from coming off. 1 thumb screw should be enough, but it's better to have 2 if you have them. And that is your computer built. We are going to plug it in next to make sure it posts, and if it did, we will do the best part, which is peeling the plastic off of the glass. All right, flip the power switch on your power supply and press the power button. And there you have it. Our computer is posting. I'm not gonna go into the whole tutorial about how to install Windows. That may be saved for another date, but that is how you build a computer. And now let's get the juicy, juicy footage of us peeling that plastic. And now we have put our very old Pentium system into a new home. I'm actually really excited to be putting such an old system into a new case. And as much as I would benefit from doing something else with this system, I think I'm gonna leave it like this and have some fun playing with it. Thanks for watching. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe. Follow us on all of our social media platforms. Check us out on Discord and check out our merch shop. Good? Yeah.